So again, as their actions in the aftermath of the invasion of Venezuela, basically revealed the lie that was, their initial claim that this was just domestic law enforcement. Everything they have done, over the last few weeks has only underscored that the basis they had, their stated basis for invoking the Alien Enemies Act, was always false. It was always an invented narrative. And that is really the core of so many of this administration's, lawless antics and abusive exercises of authority.
Okay, before we get into the bad vibes, let's get into the bad hombres and talk about the Trump administration's actions in Venezuela. And they are claiming that this is a law enforcement operation, that it's not an invasion. They've tried to justify removing Nicolas Maduro by saying he wasn't a legitimate president, he was engaged in illegal activities that hurt the United States, etc. He, of course, has said that he was kidnapped and that he'll argue probably the U.S. violated international law by arresting and imprisoning a head of state. What is your take on the legal arguments so far?
It's honestly tough to disentangle all of the lawlessness, so I will just briefly try to touch on the international law and domestic law aspects of this. So, for purposes of international law, it's a clear-cut case of absolute no-no. So, under international law, you cannot use force as a tool of policy. One state cannot invade another, in the absence of a UN Security Council resolution or an attack on that state. And none of those predicates are here. And this is just a basic foundation of the UN Charter, which is in a lot of ways the foundation of the current international order. So the military invasion of Venezuela, I think, definitely violated international law. And the difficulty, of course, with international law is, well, what happens when there's a violation? And so much of international law is enforced by the response of other countries. And so far, we've seen kind of a range of responses, with some countries being willing to outright, criticize and say the Trump administration violated international law, with others being more muted, I think, because they are concerned about possible retaliation. On the domestic side, I think the law is a little bit more murky, but it is still clear that the Trump administration violated it. So under our constitutional system, the president is only supposed to have those powers that the Constitution specifically assigns to him or that Congress has delegated to him. And under the Constitution, the Congress has the power to declare war. However, it is understood that the president has the power to repel an imminent attack. If troops that are lawfully stationed somewhere are attacked, the president has the power to respond. That's not the case here. And I just note that their claim that what they were doing was domestic law enforcement is belied by basically everything they have said and done since then. Because, of course, now, Donald Trump said we, the United States, are running the country of Venezuela. Secretary of State Marco Rubio attempted to walk that back and say, no, we're just coercing them, to govern as we see fit. None of those things are remotely part of domestic law enforcement. And so it already seems like, to the extent this is ever about domestic law enforcement, and I don't think it was, nothing we have done since then, right, is consistent with that claim. And in any case, the idea that the president has the authority to invade a foreign country in the course of executing a warrant, is inconsistent, with the idea that under the Constitution, executive officers are only supposed to be able to do what is necessary and things that they have a legal basis to do in the course of executing these warrants. So, the memo that they are relying on was actually written by, the Attorney General during Trump 1.0, Bill Barr, when he was a lawyer in the Bush administration, and before that, the Reagan administration. And that memo took the frankly outlandish position that the UN Charter, was not binding on the United States, which, again, would just be a wildly catastrophic and destabilizing, legal proposition to the extent it was correct. So that was a rough attempt to explain not a lot of law there.
Hi, I'm Pat Morrison, one of the hosts of America at a Crossroads. If you like this video, don't just watch. Head over to our website where you can subscribe for early access to new programs, see our upcoming schedules, and connect directly with our guests in our weekly live streams. Thank you for watching.
So I'm also curious about, Trump has decided or argued to use the Alien Enemies Act as a way to deport Venezuelans accused of being part of this Trinidad gang. Now, if the United States is running Venezuela, how can it then use that argument? And I mean, maybe I'm being a little facetious there, but how can the U.S. then be at war with itself if it's quote unquote running Venezuela? So what happens to that argument when it comes to deporting Venezuelan migrants?
So the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit is actually set to hear, the case about, the Alien Enemies Act later this month. And I have no doubt that this is going to come up during that argument because part of the Trump administration's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act was the already outlandish claim that the Maduro regime was really operating in conjunction with Tren de Aragua, or Tren de Aragua was effectively, infiltrating the Maduro regime. And so the two were inseparable. But now, Trump has deposed Maduro, but he has left in place the Maduro regime. Like he said, he wanted to work together and declare the vice president, the leader of Venezuela. He has left in place the entire military, that is the apparatus, that Maduro used to actually stay in power and exercise power. So again, as their actions in the aftermath of the invasion of Venezuela, basically revealed the lie that was, their initial claim that this was just domestic law enforcement. Everything they have done, over the last few weeks has only underscored that the basis they had, their stated basis for invoking the Alien Enemies Act, was always false. It was always an invented narrative. And that is really the core of so many of this administration's, lawless antics and abusive exercises of authority.
And definitely tune in next week. Larry Mantle will be here and he will host a conversation called The Politics of Hunger, Confronting Poverty in a Time of Division and Crisis. And that is next Wednesday, again, at 5 o'clock Pacific. And I will see you next time. Bye.